Curious, has anybody here been up to Anthony Lakes? Just a couple of you. If you haven't and you're new to the area, it's a really cool, it's a ski resort in the winter, but there's a lot of hiking trails and lakes and things to explore. So I was out, headed back from the trail yesterday evening, and it's getting dark. And as I go down, out of the corner of my eye, I see somebody waving, and somebody had driven their car off the road, and it was like flipped upside down off a slope. And it was a mother with like 2 4-year-old kids and a cat. She was able to get out of the car, and she was fine and okay. And she and her husband had a tent up at the top of the mountain. But I helped to try to drive her up to the top, and it was just very surreal experience. But also in that moment, there was like this experience of talking and getting to know this person and assuring her that I was a safe person to help her out, right? I think interpersonal communication can happen at some really odd times and situations, and we find ourselves in a lot of circumstances with people that we didn't expect to meet. So just an odd thing that happened. And I think as we're thinking about communication, right, a lot of ways that our communication is shaped by our interactions can really stick with us. So welcome back. So at the end of last class, I had us working on a sheet that went over some tips for writing, including some good practices. And what I would like you to do is to pull that sheet back out for those of you that were here on Monday and had the chance to work on that. I'm going to give you some time at the beginning of class to return to your partnership or group of 3 to work through the rest of this sheet if your group needs some more time. If you did not bring the sheet in or you weren't here on Monday, I do have some extras. Is there anybody who would like an extra? You. So yeah, I'm not grading this, but I do want you to take some time to look back through this and work through some answers to these. And then in a few minutes, we'll be talking about these together. Let's see. It's close. That's it. Argues. Media. Yeah, I agree. That's how you write it. So like, then still sign this. That's thing. Left side. Or it's like arguing out like the S story about. That, you know, this is ask the S. So it should be first person. Well, you can't really make that. That's a first person. Not an actual person. You can't make that.
the argument of, or the argument in this essay is stuff. Or the role of in this essay, useful in society. He argued that then we better just stick with the essay's argument. Like this media's role in society has increased. I mean, it's the simplest out of all of them, and it might not be perfect, but it's a good start towards active. Going from passive to active. Yeah, it's a certain number of words, or what they said, word counting. If you use a large quotation, here you can include like 60 some odd words, and you give it a long. Yeah, I mean, I've never dealt with this.
Looks like there are a few groups still working, so I'll give you about 2 more minutes.
Quotation would be, we're not talking about direct quotations, we're just talking about general quotations. So you need who wrote it, when it was written, the name of what was written, so the name, and eventually the source. Yeah, there have to be authors, name of the article, author's date, source, then publication, whole website.
Are there any groups who would like some additional time? Okay. So let's take some time to talk about this together. Again, this is not graded. This is just meant to help you out and help to improve your own writing. So let's talk through these questions, starting with number 1. In light of these challenges, we must act without delay. How many folks think this is MLA style? Chicago style? APA? Yep. So this is APA, and here's how you know. It is the last name of an author followed by the comma with the year, right? And if it's a direct quotation, it would also include the page number or paragraph number and other pieces. If you were to do it in MLA, right, it would look like this. No comma, just the last name of the author followed by the page number, right? And if this was in Chicago style, it would have a little 1 up here, and it would include either an endnote or a footnote. So yes, this is APA. Communication audiences can be divided into a pyramid, right? Intrapersonal at the top, mediated communication at the bottom. We talked about that last week. How many folks think this should include a citation? Okay, how many people think it shouldn't? Okay, so the house is a little divided. I would recommend a citation in this situation for a few different reasons, right? The good rule of thumb of when you should not cite your sources is if one, it's your own opinion, because no need to cite yourself, it's your argument in your essay. Or two, if what you're expressing is something that's in general public knowledge, right? This pyramid that's being used to describe different types of communication, if you went out and talked to somebody randomly on the street, they would not know about that pyramid, or they couldn't come up with that themselves, right? It's not your idea, it's an idea that's coming from the text. So in something like a Canvas prompt, right, you wouldn't need to cite it, and in a lot of situations, this would not be that big of a deal. But I think it's a really good idea in situations like this one to err on the side of caution and include a citation, even if it doesn't include the page number, right? Just a reference back to the Wrench textbook, since that's an idea that comes from the book, right? So including citations in situations like that is good, because even if it's not a direct quotation, if you're paraphrasing or summing something up in your own words, it's still a good idea to cite it. There is no harm in citing it in that situation, and it just covers your bases just in case, right? It would not be a big, horrible plagiarism event if you didn't cite that, but it's a good idea to do so. According to Johnson, we must act without delay. How many people think this should include a citation? Yes, right? So here's how you would do this. If this is APA style, right, you might do 1998, page 10, because you're citing the year as well as the page number there because it's a direct quotation. Because you already have the name Johnson in the sentence, you don't need to include that in the citation. So for instance, if you had a sentence that said, Wrench states XYZ, right, you wouldn't actually need to include the word wrench again. Yeah.
Doesn't that one kind of depend on the context? Like, let's say we don't already know who Johnson is.
Yeah.
Then you would cite it. But like, what if you're like telling a story and one of the person's name is Johnson?
Yes. Yes. So if this was just like dialogue, right? Yeah. You're talking to a friend, an activity, yeah, that would be totally fine. I think for this one, we might assume that Johnson's an author.
Yeah. I didn't see the name of it, so
yeah. No problem. Good question. And then, right, in MLA, you must act without delay. You would just include the 10 after that. So if the author name is in the sentence, you do not need to include them in parentheses again at the end of the sentence. In my own opinion, more communication should be interpersonal rather than mediated. How many people think this needs a citation? Correct, it does not, right? Because it's your own opinion. So if you're expressing your own perspective on the issue, you would not need to cite yourself. There is something called self-plagiarism that exists if you have formally written or published something, right? And you're citing yourself again in that thing. So when I'm like trying to publish work in journals, right, I'm actually required to cite myself because it's a legal issue. But for things like this class, or if you're expressing your own opinion, that's not a big deal. So you don't need to do that. In the opinion advanced in this essay, it is argued that media's role in society has significantly increased. So I'd like to hear from a couple groups who took a stab at this sentence and tried to clean this up a little bit. What was the sentence you came up with instead? Or group or two that's willing to share. Yeah.
This essay argument is that the role of media and then opinions on the same thing, just changing that first part to make it active.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody come up with anything different here? So this is a good starting point. I think that in the opinion advanced in this essay, right, it's incredibly clunky, hard to read, and just like adds content without saying anything. This essay argument is a lot more concise, right? It pares those down quite a bit, and it uses is, present tense. The role of media has significantly increased, right? You are compressing that media's role in society is part of the sentence. Another model you could do is to say something like, in this essay, I argue that media's role in society has significantly increased, right? That would be another way to go. Remember that for this class, you're welcome to use first-person pronouns to refer to things because I'm asking you to reflect on your own experiences in communication a lot of the time. Using first person is totally fine, right? When is it appropriate to use large block quotations? Well, one of the groups back here, is there anything that came to mind about using those? Yes. Okay, so you're quoting somebody else and using block quotations. Let's think a little bit more. So you're quoting somebody else, but when you're using a large block quotation, when is that content relevant? So I'll help you out a little bit, right? When you're using a large block quotation, it should only be when all of that quotation is relevant to your argument or relevant to your point, right? I have graded essays in which people will submit block quotations, but there is only like a sentence or only the first line in that block quotation that actually connects to or supports the argument that you're trying to make in your paper. Block quotations can fill in space for sure, but a block quotation does not speak for itself, right? At the end of the day, when you're writing a paper, it's about you. It's about your opinion and about your perspective. What are you saying? The quotation does not speak for itself. So kind of think about it this way, right? If you're buying school supplies, you're not going to buy a whole bunch of binders and notebooks and pens and other things that you don't need, right? You're going to buy the things that you know that you need for your classes and get the things that will prevent you from having to spend a whole bunch of money on things. In the same way, when you're structuring a paper, only include the parts of the quotation that you need that are relevant. Ask yourself, do I need all of this? Is all of this important to my point? Or are there parts that I can cut out and reduce this quotation to? So a complete citation, right? For a complete citation, you would want to include both in-text and a works cited list, right? Again, if you're doing APA, you would do author, year, and then if you're quoting a specific page number, page. In MLA, it is author, page, and then Chicago would have the footnote or endnote. Any questions on any of these? Yes.
All right, so I just want to make sure I understand the definition of large block quotation.
Mm-hmm.
So would that be multiple sentences strung out, like you're just taking one block out of the text, or like, so we were talking about, me and our partner were talking about, and he was thinking it was, you know, a certain amount of words, which makes sense. But I'm just having a hard time.
Sure.
It's not something I run into, so it's
yeah. So it varies a bit depending on the citation format, right? Typically, there is either like a word limit or a number of lines, such as 4 lines or more. And typically, the way that you would do block quotations is you would do a space, and then you would do another indent, and the quotation itself is single-spaced. So what I recommend is if you're including a large quotation, to double check the Purdue OWL style guidelines to make sure that the block quotation that you're using matches what that style is, because there are variations between those different styles. So yeah, that's a good question, right? Longer quotations that meet that criteria. So if you're using a large quotation in your paper, there's a good chance that you should take a look at the style guidelines for that. I also went ahead and provided grades and feedback on the first Canvas prompts for the folks who completed and turned those in. In general, across the board, I think people did a really good job. I wanted to highlight things that you had done well and also give you some feedback on areas to work on going forward, since I know many of you might be working on the next one due this Friday. So if you're doing this Fridays, I definitely recommend reviewing feedback if you turned in the last one too to help you with this one. Just a couple things that I noticed to continue to work on. One of them was run-on sentences, right? So I definitely encourage you to use commas to break up some of the larger sentences, making sure to use like capitalization for proper nouns, things like names. And also, right, sometimes there are things like a couple fragments here and there. This is, or like going to the store, right? That would not be a full sentence because it doesn't include an agent, an action, right? I'm going to the store would fit as a fuller sentence. So there were just a couple grammatical issues, some sentence structure issues in a couple parts. And then the other thing is just to make sure that you're fully addressing each part of the prompt. There were a couple sections where the part discussing the ethical communicator could have been a bit more clear in the principles that you were drawing from. So I really liked when there was like a highlight or bold or kind of specific explanation of the parts that you were responding to in the question. And again, across the board, these were really solid. Okay. This worksheet is going to continue to be available for you to access on Canvas at any point, so you're welcome to refer back to that. Please make sure your names are on the sheet that you worked on, and please pass forward that worksheet. All right, so thank you for working on that. Again, I'm not grading that, but it's just an activity to help you in exploring some of these ideas. So we talked a bit about writing and did that writing activity last class. For today, we're going to focus on interpersonal communication, right? So we'll be talking about why interpersonal communication is important and also some of the ways that our personality and identity comes to be reflected through our interpersonal communication. Just as a quick refresher, what is interpersonal communication? Not inter, but intra. Yes?
Communication with yourself.
Yes. So intrapersonal communication, right, is at the tippy top of that pyramid that we saw last week, right? Interpersonal communication is with yourself. Interpersonal communication is between two people. So interpersonal communication is incredibly important. It's something that we might think about as a bit silly, but it's something that we do actively without even thinking, right? Because say you're waking up and you're trying to decide what to wear for the day, right? Which shirt, which tie am I going to wear? That's interpersonal communication. You're talking to yourself, saying, do I wear the gray pants or black pants, right? That's an example of using interpersonal communication. Why? Because we use language as a way of organizing the thoughts in our brain. So on one extreme, right, we have thinking to ourselves. We do that a lot. You're having a conversation with somebody and you can't help but start drifting off and thinking about how you have practice after class, right? So that's on one end of the spectrum. On the other end, we have talking out loud, right? So maybe you have a big job interview coming up and you're practicing questions and saying those questions to yourself. Or maybe you're singing in the shower, right? We think it's kind of funny to talk to ourselves. Sometimes we think it's a little bit weird. Sometimes we think that, you know, maybe there's something wrong with us if we're talking to ourselves. But studies show that that's a healthy human behavior, right? It's something we do to help to organize our thoughts, to refer, to practice for what we're doing. So interpersonal communication is something that we find to be really useful, that we have all these thoughts and ideas in our heads, right? So it happens within yourself, right? You don't have an audience or person that you're talking to. Somebody in my other class asked, is it interpersonal communication if I'm yelling at a car in front of me, but I'm not actually like in that car right there over there? And it would depend upon whether or not they actually see you and see your nonverbal response, right? If you're yelling and they don't actually see you, it's interpersonal. And if we think back to Maslow's hierarchy, right, we use interpersonal communication and talking to ourselves to fulfill those human needs. In particular, right, if you are practicing for a job interview, that would be an example of using a safety need to try to get that fulfilled for communication. So interpersonal communication seems silly, but it's useful for us in a lot of situations in our lives. In addition to that, right, you might think back to last week when I asked you to use a few different words to describe yourselves. And that's an example of how self-esteem and communication are incredibly connected. A lot of you mentioned that you would consider yourselves to be kind people, to be outgoing people. How do we know this about ourselves or make those judgments about ourselves? Probably because of other people who have told us those things about us, or because those are things that we wanted, right? We use our communication with other people to help us build a sense of who we are and some of the things about us that we think are true. And then we use that to then shape how we think about ourselves and how we share who we are with others. So it's a circular, cyclical process of developing our sense of self-esteem, using communication to better understand ourselves and so forth, right? Oftentimes as teenagers, we struggle with self-esteem because we're struggling with building a sense of identity. What are the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves? How do we figure out who we are, right? The quest for identity is the modern pilgrimage. Our understanding and development of a sense of self happens and is shared through communication. So I'm going to show an example. It's kind of funny, but I think does a good job of highlighting some of the ways that interpersonal communication and communication with other people connect to each other. So there was a film that came out in 2015 called The Duff, it's a very offensive slur term, right? It's standing for designated ugly fat friend, which we can critique from a lot of different angles, right? The use of fat shaming, the way that it portrays somebody as just kind of there in the background, right? A lot of kind of insults and slurs are used a lot, especially in school growing up, that we experience from other people, right? And one of the challenges that we find through school and through our experience is the ways that those narratives stick and hold true to who we are, right? So we might find that who we want to be and how other people are talking about or framing who we are not connected. So I'm going to show a trailer from this film that I think highlights this sort of disconnection in interpersonal communication and the ways that other people understand us through communication.
Talk about minutes. The class that still exists. Job. Keep brand new label.
Really cool stuff.
It's actually not my job to give you intel for my best friends.
It is though, that's the job.
Sorry, I was on what?
No, DUFF. Designated ugly fat friend.
What did you just say to me?
Every group of friends has one. You know, the one who doesn't look as good, that's making their friends look better. The one who's easy to talk to because no one's trying to get with them. You find it out. Good talk. I'm sorry.
How could you talk to me that I did your job? A what?
Oh, no, you did. I didn't say it. Yes, you did.
You won't be anybody's stuff. You're the dateable one. I will make sure you pass science if you help me.
You got the easy part. That's the reverse stuff you are. You wearing pajamas?
I want to go shopping. I could have done that with Beth and Casey. I need you to give me real talk.
You got a unit boob, your posture sucks. You need to start dressing less like Wreck-It Ralph. Boom, real talk.
That people like you will never matter here.
You need to realize you're only as awesome as you think you are.
So mean high school things, right? There's a lot of films and media representation of that experience that can be really challenging. But, right, this label that is being used to describe her, right, is not how she thought she was to other people, to her friends, but it causes her to have a lot of self-doubt, to question her relationships with her friends, to try to figure out whether or not her friends actually trust her and support her in the ways that she thought that they did, right? And the labels that we use to describe a lot of people that we know, including people from school, right, can be really common, really pervasive, and shape our sense of self and our use of interpersonal communication, right? In this example, this slang term, right, this label is being used to create this idea of a negative self-evaluation. She has this double take where she's like questioning her relationships with other people, with who she is, based on this term. And it has this incongruity with self-image, with how she would like to be and like to be portrayed by other people, that doesn't quite match how her relationships are. We use communication to make these evaluations and judgments about our self-worth. Do we see ourselves as good people? Are we proud of who we are, right? That happens through interpersonal communication process. So Carl Rogers put forth this idea of 3 different selves, and Rogers' argument is pretty simple. If we're healthy, right, there's an extent to which these 3 different circles overlap with each other. And I'll be talking about these 3 different parts in a little bit more detail. But self-concept requires us to have self-image, self-worth, and an ideal self. Self-image doesn't necessarily have a value judgment to it, but it's more about how you view yourself as a person, the things that make you who you are. Self-worth would involve more of an evaluation, whether or not you're a good person and the things that are true about yourself are good or not, right? And then an ideal self would be who you would want to be. And the idea goes here that if these parts are somewhat congruent, who you are has at least some overlap with who you would like to be. So for instance, I might not be able to lift 200 pounds, but I can lift about 150 and I'm making progress toward my goal, right? Our mental health, our well-being is improved if we feel like we at least have some attainability toward that broader goal, right? Or if our self-image and self-worth are connected, that would mean that to some extent we like who we are, right? So this idea of these 3 things being connected shapes our communication and shapes the overall judgments that we make about ourselves. Self-image, right, is pretty straightforward. An easy example of self-image is to say, I'm a tall person, right? That would be a statement of fact that's not making a judgment about who you are, but it's just something about yourself that you know to be true. So again, some of the words that you use to describe yourself, some of the facts, and some of that basic information might form and constitute your self-image. In that trailer we just saw, right, the main character is dealing with a difference in her self-image, how she's seen by other people versus how she thought they saw her, right? So at times, our self-image is pretty constantly building and rebuilding itself, right? As teenagers, we might be trying new things, new activities, wearing new clothes, figuring out who we are and how we might label and identify ourselves. So self-image is not a static thing, right? In fact, there have been some studies and reports that have come out where people in COVID who thought that they were incredibly introverted came to experience social isolation and came to realize that their social needs were different, right? They were not that isolated or introverted in what they wanted in their relationships. So our self-image can change over time. There's also this notion of self-worth. Again, that is this idea of value that you put onto yourself. So oftentimes when we think about value, we think about something that's monetary, right? This costs $40. When it comes to self-worth, then, the things that make us who we are to us carry their own set of importance, relevance, and whether or not we see that as good. So for instance, if you were to say, I'm lucky to be tall, being tall means that I can grab the cereal box from the top shelf for my little sister instead of having to get a stool or chair, right? That would be making a positive evaluation about that aspect of yourself. One, I think, important way to think about self-worth is that it's really dependent and defined by culture, right? If we think about things like body image, the body image norms across different cultures can look really different. In many cultures, for instance, being larger, right, and being more heavy set is actually a sign of good health and prosperity. So depending on culture, self-worth can be different. In more individualistic cultures like the United States, we tend to value more independent and success-driven action at an individual level. In more collectivist cultures with higher population density, countries such as China or Japan, there tends to be greater focus on harmony in a group. So in this way, we might evaluate self-worth differently. Am I a good person on my own? Am I successful? Or do I add to the group or support the group in what they're trying to do? I like the image to kind of define the ideal self, because if you've ever played chess, you know that when a pawn makes it all the way to the end of the chessboard, It can transform into a queen, a bishop, a rook, or a knight, right? And in that way, it's an ideal self because the pawn's trying to get there. It knows that if it makes it to the end, it gets to transform, right? But it's not there yet. And that's, I think, a way of thinking about the ideal self in a realistic context. An ideal self is not saying, I wish I was a famous celebrity, right? Because in most situations, we're not going to take off. Although if you do, that's awesome. I'll say that you were in my class. But, right, oftentimes we're not going to get to that point. But an ideal self is where you see yourself, as a lot of people ask in a job interview 10 years from now. Who do you wish you were? And oftentimes we find ourselves in a state of imperfection. We don't like physical appearance. Maybe we didn't do well on a test or exam and we want to do better, right? You wish you were a couple of inches taller. So that's how you envision yourself ideally. And again, we use communication in order to create this idea of an ideal self. We imagine who that self is. We use interpersonal communication to try to get there. So for instance, you might say, okay, I'm going to try to study and memorize my Spanish homework so that I can do well on the test. So an ideal self is used a lot in communication to convey this idea of who we want to be, right? We can also think about the ideal self as shaped and in many ways modified through media, right? Ideal body image and representations through media of what we should look like or how we're supposed to be, and whether we accept or reject those labels, right, are very closely connected to this idea of the ideal self. So again, we put those three things together: who we are, we see that as good or bad, and who we want to be. And ideally, in the way that we communicate interpersonally about ourselves, there's some overlap there between those three different parts. There's also this idea of self-esteem, right? And self-esteem is somewhat similar to self-worth, but it is a larger evaluation of yourself as a whole, right? So you're looking at your abilities, limitations, what you can and cannot do, the things that make you who you are, and you're rendering a broader judgment about yourself as a person, right? Self-esteem, of course, is something that a lot of us continue to deal with as a challenge, right? And can be something that we find ourselves struggling, especially as teenagers, right? And in navigating early adulthood. Self-esteem, of course, is subjective and it's an evaluation. In other words, right, subjective means that it's not necessarily based on facts or based on evidence. You might be familiar with the phrase, we are our own worst critics. And in this way, right, we use self-esteem to judge probably the most minute details about us that other people are not necessarily going to catch. I'll give you an example. When I was in grade school, I had a spelling test and I got 19 out of 20. I missed one. And the one word that I missed was lettuce. And I was so upset that I missed the word lettuce that I made a scene and very loudly ripped up my test and threw it in the trash, right? I've never once misspelled lettuce after that, but it's an example of how we can be incredibly hard on ourselves and make evaluations and judgments about us that aren't necessarily based on fact, that can be really distorted. You give a speech or presentation, or you share an idea in class and you say, oh, I just sound terrible. I don't like what I said. I wasn't very articulate. And to everybody else, they thought you did a great job. We oftentimes find ourselves less trusting of people who reassure us, right, or tell us that we're doing okay, because we think that they don't really understand, or they're just being nice, right? We're using those things to try to filter out our own negative self-perception. And again, an evaluation is some type of judgment, right? It's saying at the end of the day, do I like who I am? And we use our own interpersonal communication as part of making that judgment, figuring out how we feel about ourselves, if we like the way that we look, if we like what we did, and we might make changes in how we communicate or present ourselves to other people. There's also this idea of the looking glass self, which is a little bit more complicated. Think about the looking glass self as the idea of if you were recorded and you got to see yourself what would that look like, right? The term looking glass self comes from Alice in Wonderland, looking glass, right? And the looking glass self is essentially how we imagine ourselves as looking to other people. Say you're about to go on a date, and before the date, you get like a really nasty stain on your shirt. You only have time to like clean it up. You don't have time to change clothes, right? You're hoping as you're on this date that you got that stain and that stain is not showing up prominently during the date, right? But as you're on the date, you're imagining, okay, what do I look like to the other person? Do they see the stain on my shirt? What are they thinking about me, right? So we use imagination to reflect our performances, right? All the world's a stage. Communication is not just verbal. It's not just what we say. It's also through nonverbal communication, right? Our performance every day, the clothing that we wear, the way that we present ourselves, our use of nonverbals and facial expressions, like we are always communicating. We cannot not communicate, right? We're imagining what that looks like to other people. Oftentimes we look in the mirror as an easy way to do that, right? We also like to imagine what other people think of us. What do they think as we're talking to them or as they see us? Do they think that I'm like a not very clean person because I have this stain on my shirt? Or what nonverbal cues tell me that this person is interested and wants to talk, right? If somebody's paying attention and nodding, or if they're on their phones, right? That is a way that we try to fill in those gaps mentally. That's why nonverbal communication matters, right? And then we react to this imagination. If I know how I look to other people, if I know that I have this stain on, I'm going to feel anxious and on edge. So again, right, we are imagining how we look to other people, and we use interpersonal communication to try to figure out what we look like, how we're talking, and how we show up to other people, right? Oftentimes we find ourselves frustrated if we record and hear a recording of ourselves. I hate hearing myself talk and looking back through class videos, right? And that's an example of feeling that disconnect between how we want to present ourselves to other people and how other people are perceiving us. So looking glass self helps to make sense of that. And then the last idea I wanted to hit on is this notion of self-compassion. There's a really funny visual in this week's reading that's like of a vulture that's over somebody's shoulder, right? And the vulture and vulture thoughts are kind of like these negative personality traits, the things that are telling you that you can't do something. If you've seen Winnie the Pooh, right, it's like Eeyore, who's always the pessimist. It's the negative stories about yourself. Oh, I'm always going to fail tests. I'm never going to make it to class on time, right? That can at times become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The idea that you feed and give time to these negative thoughts, like feeding scraps to a vulture, allow that to continue to grow. The contrast is this idea of self-compassion, right? Showing the same kindness and courtesy to ourselves that we oftentimes would show toward other people, right? You know, to quote RuPaul, if you don't love yourself, how the heck are you going to love anybody else, right? So self-compassion is about showing sympathy and compassion for yourself and not being your own worst critic and giving yourself a little bit of leeway, right? So with those things in mind, and the way that interpersonal communication shapes our identity, I'd like you, for your attendance activity today, to get out a sheet of paper. You could also type this if this is easier for you. I'd like you to think back to the words that you used to describe yourself last week and think about some additional ones that you might use. And once you've done that, I want you to sort these into different categories: self-image, self-worth, and ideal self. And once you've done that sorting, I want you to kind of take note on what you're noticing, whether or not there's overlap between those parts. So I'll give you some time to work through that. You don't have to share it with the class or anything like that, but it's a chance for you to reflect on it. haven't already, you might take a moment to reflect on what you're noticing in these categories. So I think that as you're reflecting on and thinking about these words, how you define yourself and where you see yourself placing those aspects of your communication, right? It's this idea that we're always changing, and the labels we might use might be even different than the things you used to describe yourself last week. The idea here, though, is that communication is the thing that is gluing and sticking to and shaping how we're defining those elements of ourselves. This idea of shared meaning, what those labels and identifiers mean to you in the context of your relationships. So just as a couple quick reminders, the second Canvas prompt is due this Friday. Again, if you completed the first, I recommend looking through your feedback to help you in working through that. The other thing is that there is the syllabus quiz for Friday. That's OpenNote and OpenBook. It's just on Canvas. So make sure to complete that syllabus quiz by Friday if you haven't already done so. For today, as a reminder, you're welcome to reach out if you have any other questions or need additional support with the process of writing for your classes. We started talking about interpersonal communication, how we come to know and understand ourselves, and how we evaluate who we are through things like self-worth and self-image. Next class, we'll be looking at personality and media and some of the ways that those can shape our own interpersonal communication. So go ahead and either pass forward or email me your individual work for today. Have a great rest of your afternoon, and I'll see you again on Friday.